There are 36 people registered, and I'm hoping that means half of them make it. So we'll give it another moment or two. But if you're here, please introduce yourself in the chat. Is that a classic Manna Joe Green introduction with the fishes? I have to laugh. Welcome everybody to the webinar briefing on the Regional Climate Action Roadmap and Toolkit Initiative. I'm going to try to present while monitoring the waiting room here. I'm Melissa Everett with Sustainable Hudson Valley. I am recording in the hope that we actually get some lively discussion that will be worth capturing, and I won't just be listening to myself the whole darn time. A lot of you have been involved in this project, and I can't thank you enough for the substantial leap of faith that it represents. But we have a framework and some tools attached to it, and we are kind of in latter stages of tweaking. We are calling it a discussion draft and enthused about feedback. The feedback has been substantive, deliberate, nobody's like nitpicking. It's wonderful. But let me just outline what I hope to accomplish in the next hour, if I can get my notes away from Buttercup the cat. And I do see that we have people from county planning agencies, from investment world, from NGOs. I'm very excited about that. So I want to share the resource that we've created, the goals and aspirations for it, sort of sketch of who, who participated, how it came together. And above all, I want to get your feedback on what we can actually do with this that is useful in the real world of dealing with climate change. So I'm going to go through a few slides quickly, then I'm going to show you the website. Then I'm going to go back and just share some of the top line content using slides, but pause a number of times so that we can really interact with the different facets of this thing while it's fresh in our minds. So let's see how this works. And people are still dropping in, so I will try to be as smooth as possible here. And I'm going to share my screen. And if you've landed after I've introduced the flow of the day, please, or the hour, please do introduce yourself in the chat. I'm seeing some folks, but not as many as I know are here. So everybody's thinking about climate change. New York has a visionary law. There is some political push and pull around implementing this visionary law. And I have had the good fortune to be part of a circle that a number of you are part of, who were involved in a sustainability plan more than 10 years ago. and who basically kept meeting to share what we knew was going on and to encourage each other. Not a heavily structured thing, but we called ourselves the Mid-Hudson Regional Sustainability Coalition, and we were hosted by the Hudson Valley Regional Council for a while, by Orange County Planning. And when the climate law was passed, we said, this is our moment. Let's actually try to do an updated vision of an action plan, emphasis on the action, that can unify, that can inspire, that can get us out of the weeds, hopefully. So I think of it, what we've done here, as a critical path analysis, to say, what do we need to do by 2030, by 2040 and onward? And what do we need to do in the near term to be prepared and organized? It's looking at vision and action, what needs to happen, how much, and who needs to do it. It's independent of the New York climate law, but very supportive of it, very much oriented toward translating it to the regional scale. And it focuses on courses of collective action. It's not what can a household do, it's not what should the state do. It is what can we as a region, the communities within it, the networks of interest within it do that is big enough to matter and still small enough to be clear on. So here are some of the organizations that have been at the table. Pat Pomeroy for the Regional Council, the former executive director, and I kind of co-convened with a lot of, many of you on this call were co-conveners. Anna Jo Green has faithfully kept an energy working group going. We've had other subject area working groups that I'll talk about in a bit. I will say that as we were setting out to do this thing, there was a small hiccup called a pandemic, and there was basically no way in hell that this was going to be a super formal, structured process. But this was an iterative process with around 90 skilled volunteers. I think that number is probably higher now, who provided inputs, who drafted content, who gave feedback, who challenged assumptions. It was organized around three guiding questions. What is the critical path to achieving the famous in our circles 2030 and 2040 climate commitments on the ground? We are not talking about policy. We're talking about who really has to get what done, who needs to be involved, and what can we in the room do that's not already being done that will kind of build momentum. So I don't think we need to belabor that New York's climate law is driving, not just asking for, but driving an unprecedented, can I say it, statewide transformation. I think most of us are familiar with the Climate Action Council and the scoping plan that was created with over 20,000 comments. And I'm fact checking this number, but this is a minimum. With a 2-year policy framing process. And now we are in a period when DEC, NYSERDA, and numerous other agencies are charged with making comprehensive policies and rules. We are in a 2-year period when there's some political pushback, a little bit, and a special need for people, the constituents of all of you on this call, the people that you work with, to understand what this thing is. I highlight a couple things that to me are important about the state law because it shows the seriousness and it shows the innovativeness of what we're dealing with. The commitment, 35 to 40% of state climate funding will go to the historically overburdened and undersupported communities. They are actually setting up an Office of Just Transition, which is about helping the fossil fuel industry workforce to transition to find good, relevant jobs. and making sure that the transition within the whole energy and transportation system and the broader systems is done equitably. So the state framework is, you can see here, energy, buildings, transportation, agriculture, forestry, waste, and industry, nothing broad. I'll go through this really quickly. This is what the climate law is inviting us to do. Green the grid and electrify everything. And you can just see these numbers of how much distributed solar and energy storage and offshore wind there needs to be. Transforming transportation, and that's new electric car sales, phasing in electric trucks and buses and transit, and a major shift, to transit and also to pedestrian and bike uses of those things as ways to get around. And electrify and weatherize, basically over 20 years, all of our buildings. It's huge. It's an evolutionary project. We're not going to do it all tomorrow, but we're aiming for 1 to 2 million energy efficient homes using heat pumps in the next 7 years, and building codes and standards to support that. So that's the quick state framework. To me, what we're dealing with regionally is a big question in 3 parts. Does this all happen to us? And if so, does that work? Does it fall apart because there's political pushback, or it's just too massive? Or do we shape it according to local values and resources? So that's the setup. I'm going to stop sharing for a moment, and I want to walk over in a second to the website that we created to organize content to address those questions. And then I will come back to walking through the slides. But just let me go to https://hvclimateroadmap.org. And let me just walk you through that for 1 second. We initially published this ponderous PDF, and it had had chapters on energy, buildings, transportation, agriculture, forestry, land use, environmental justice, economic development, resilience, education. We called that last cluster cross-cutting themes that we really tried to see in everything. And I was so gratified by how much good work went into this, but we looked at it last fall and said, yeah, it's good, but it's not great. And so what we've actually tried to create here is a better designed resource that has the same content, but has it in bite-sized bites. And so can you see? Here's a menu. And it's mostly the same as the State Climate Act. There's one thing I'll call attention to. We had done in the old sustainability plan a section on water. The state doesn't do that in the climate law. They deal with water resources in other ways. But we said, storms, droughts, drinking water supply, this is going to be important. And we just went for it. And it has led us to realize how there's a glaring absence of coordinated planning for water supply and water quality as climate changes. So that's the kind of thing that we came up with. So there's all this subject matter stuff. We did a little playing with how we would think about the path forward. And I'm not convinced we've got it quite right, but I'll just show you quickly. We made some timelines, imagining 2030 and 2040. And these might be useful in some of your communities or some of your organizations. to be thinking, so what do we have to get done? So climate trends, what's, likely not worst, but not best case scenario. The future we want, kind of an invitation to imagine what we want to get done as we tackle climate change. The state's commitments, and then I have this little thing, organization for action. And this is just basically something to play with, looking at this year and next year, this incredibly important 2-year period. I'm going to say that all the time. How can we prepare and organize for successful implementation of our climate action goals? What kind of structure, what resources do we need? How will we track progress? How will we make sure, I couldn't help but throw this in, how we make sure to take care of ourselves on the path. Let me see, I'm just going to show you a couple other things about how this is organized. There is a section called Putting It All Together, and I'm especially eager for tough feedback on that. Are we thinking this through well? But it's got areas of suggested regional collaboration. It's got some specific projects, which I'll talk about when I go back to the slides. It's got a section on how do we pay for it. It's got a section on how we might organize diverse interests. So before I go back to kind of walking you through the major conclusions we came to, are there any either questions or comments so far? Okie doke, I will keep going.
Melissa, this is Jeff Scales. So to give you a comment, you deserve a comment, right? So one of the things on your list that appeared not there, unless I missed it, was nature. And I feel like we're not focusing enough that preserving nature while we address climate change is so important, because if we lose biodiversity, all is lost. So what can be incorporated, or do you feel it's just not on the table for this roadmap?
That's beautiful, Jeff. I didn't use the word nature in what I've said to you, and I've been kind of going quickly through this overview, but you're going to see sections about agriculture and forestry, and I'm using the human-centered term land use, but it's really land stewardship, and water and resilience, and you couldn't agree more. Nature goes through all of these. And even as we talk about energy development, it's essential that we talk about how to minimize conflicts between renewable energy development and protection of farms and forests and biodiversity, which happily is the next thing I'm going to talk with you about. So let's see, screen share. Okay, so the energy discussion looked at the fact that the state is investing and creating incentives and creating, pressing the utilities to plan for grid modernization and creating an office of renewable energy siting to sort out disputes. They're doing all the right things from the state perspective. And the good news is the utilities are planning for how they're going to modernize the grid to absorb all and transmit all this renewable energy. The bad part is they're doing it behind closed doors in a very formal, stodgy, if I dare say, regulatory process. And meanwhile, communities are looking at incentives that make it much easier to develop renewable energy on green fields and on farms, places that are close to the grid and already, close to roads, that kind of thing, versus closed landfills, brownfields. There's no incentives for those. We looked at the case of New Paltz, for example, where they spent, a year and a half of volunteer time figuring out how to put solar on a closed landfill, which is the ideal kind of location for it, only to realize when they got a developer and went to the utility and asked what would be the interconnection fee, which can only happen when you have a developer, it was $1.7 million. And so the economic incentives are not aligning. Communities are confused. They get polarized easily. And this is an example I'm really excited about, that as the working group with Mana's leadership and Audrey Friedrichsen from Scenic Hudson and several people who wore multiple hats as even energy developers and conservation commissioners, a project emerged before we even had the recommendations written down. And it was to take a map analysis tool that Scenic Hudson had created, How to Solar Now, and work with a series of clusters of communities. And Mana Joe Green and Melissa Ayasheta from New Yorkers for Clean Power drove this. And I think they've worked with close to 100 people to begin thinking, like, where do we put the solar that doesn't impinge on the farms and that we're not necessarily going to fight about? And, how do we make sure that our zoning is in good shape? So this, yes, in my backyard, this is an example of, the emerging strategies from this thing, but the action is emerging even faster than the strategy statements, which makes me very happy. In the course of thinking about how to protect farms and forests and roll out renewables, we learned that New York State Solar Farm, which is a very good developer, was interested in demonstrating what's called agrivoltaics, where you integrate them. And so is Cornell. Jared Buono from Cornell Cooperative Extension chaired our agricultural working group, and we were able to put them together. And they are now well along in planning an agrivoltaics demonstration program that has rows of fruit trees and rows of grapevines interspersed with renewable energy. So it's not an either or. We looked at how to use all kinds of aspects of our built environment and integrate more natural solutions. Things like biochar and enhanced weathering in soils to make soils absorb carbon better, low embodied carbon building and structural materials like they are doing with concrete in Hastings on Hudson. So we have, just as a thought exercise, again, timelines. And this is really a straw thing for folks to think about. Is this how we should portray it? Perhaps this year we strengthen that network of energy stakeholders who want to plan locally for yes in my backyard. Perhaps we identify, where there are sites that communities can get behind and begin to open a dialogue with the utilities and the Public Service Commission. I didn't go into detail on buildings, but you remember those millions of buildings that we have to weatherize and electrify. And the crux there is getting building owners and communities engaged and working with them to make that affordable. There is a state-funded program called the Clean Energy Hubs, which is, it's energy outreach people, social service agencies, really creative thing. And our vision is just to support that, to add other interested parties to help that program build connections. So this is the kind of identifying strategies that we're just examining. We're just seeing what makes sense. Let me stop there, and I'll keep the screen share on. But in terms of energy, just as a way of going at it, any comments or questions about Yes in My Backyard or about this timeline? And I can't see the chat because I've got too many windows open. So if you have a comment, just sing out, okay?
Gail Enstrom had a comment. She wrote, I have a major concern about disinformation, aka lies, from the fossil fuel industry. This isn't directly related to what you're talking about right now. And their efforts to sabotage all these climate actions. How can we effectively combat that? I see it as a very relevant issue, communicating the truth about alternative energies and not they're coming to take out your furnace. This could include lawsuits against lies.
Bless you, Gail. We will get to education a few slides down, but it's critical. And, you know, we had a conference recently. We had Mark Lowry from the New York State Climate Office, and he said, we're really not going to take your gas stove. We are going to make it harder for you to buy a new gas stove in 7 years. And we're going to make it easier for you to buy an induction stove, which you will enjoy. I have one and I enjoy it. So I think there's a way of having the conversation that is, on the one hand, saying, yes, this is a law that is going to phase out appliances and, you know, energy systems that we're used to. And there are going to be people who can't keep doing what they're doing. The beneficiaries outweigh the people who will need to accommodate hugely. The net new jobs is something like 210,000 by 2030. But we still need to make sure that people who have been delivering propane their whole lives aren't expected to be climbing up on roofs, installing solar panels, that they have options that are within their skills and respectful of their pay grade. Otherwise, what is happening now is that several of the fossil energy industry associations are just pushing money to everybody they contribute to campaign-wise and putting out these very distorted messages. And so I think groups like we have gathered here are critical to understand the situation and be able to be an informed source of information in your social circles. Any other questions, Barbara? Thank you for keeping on top of those.
There's a comment from Man Joe. Some of us are seeking a nonprofit to host a buying co-op for propane and home heating oil that doesn't send out disinformation as we promote the transition to a renewable energy economy.
Go Manna. Okay, transportation. You know, again, it's electrification. Again, the state has a pretty smart framework for incentives in the short term for electric cars. You know, you're all seeing the federal incentives taking form, and they're not simple. But we're seeing dealerships and industry associations getting on board. Pattern for Progress has done a wonderful study of where the charging really is and where the gaps are. So the work to be done is to make sure that there aren't charging deserts, that people can really access EV charging, to make sure over time that the bigger and pricier electric vehicles are accessible. Electric school buses are virtually free in low-income communities through EPA. But this stuff has to be aligned with planning for upgrading the grid and pricing and scheduling of how much the charging costs, or that transition won't be affordable. We took note of and expressed a lot of enthusiasm for the beginnings of renewably powered maritime transportation, and you probably know the Solaris. You may not know there's a whole consortium of naval architects that really have their pretty sophisticated wish list for more solar powered boats, potentially even ferries. And this is something that the Hudson Valley can uniquely contribute on. I'm going to not go into every detail on this, or we'll be here at 3 o'clock. You'll be mad at me. One of the biggest pieces that state government can't deal with by itself, even metropolitan government can't deal with, that communities have to deal with, is making transit not just run, but attractive, and helping people to make use of it. We were involved in sadly not successful community engagement around a potential microtransit project in Ulster County. And nobody is getting this right. And the regional kind of vision is to bring people together and manage demand and figure out how to make transit, walking, and biking, connect to people's needs. There is this concept called the mobility hub, and they've got one in early stage development in Ossining, where there is microtransit, little shuttles. There are e-bikes and a rent to own program, so that people who can't afford a car can access some kind of electric transportation. So that's the kind of thing we all need to study up on. And, in terms of a timeline, I just kind of envision this year, next year, really look at how to organize more of this, catalyzing of demand, so that it's not just incentives sitting there going begging and grant programs that communities don't know about. This is what I've been most excited about, because I know there are several materials management professionals on this call. 12% of the state's emissions is managing waste. This scary looking spider diagram was done by Ariana Henry, our student at Vassar College. She's graduating this spring. She spent a semester mapping materials flows to figure out what the patterns were, county by county, and try to set the stage for thinking regionally about reducing waste and capturing materials. And that longest line is obviously to the Seneca Meadows landfill. So all those trucks that take all our waste to Seneca Meadows at 3.5 miles to the gallon and idle before they drop it off are going to get more and more expensive. And that is a leverage point to think about how to divert much more waste. The state food scrap law is one. New York recently passed a right to repair law that consumer products have to be designed to be repairable. And it's, categories that are applicable. It's not perfect. But in the first meeting of our materials management working group, Emily Hauser, God love her, blurted out, "Stop transporting waste." And that's become the kind of challenge idea. How much could we do? How could we do it? And I'm happy that we've had a number of staff people from county resource recovery agencies paying attention to this effort as much as possible. I came up with one strategy that I'd love your feedback on. Now that we know a little more about, what the common themes are of who's shipping what where. And the strategy is, could our counties think together about one material at a time? And think about how to stop transporting it and build a market for reuse and remanufacturing. And, you know, Ulster County, we're under contract with them to be doing a feasibility study for a reuse innovation center that focuses a lot on building and construction salvage, but lots of other reuse opportunities. I mentioned the glass in low carbon concrete. That might be another. So I'm going to pause again and really welcome your thoughts about, you know, that way of reframing how we manage stuff. And is there potentially a strategy worth exploring in that approach? And my heart will be broken if nobody has comment.
Melissa, what do you know already from the work you did about communication in the region among different solid managers? I know that there's a group that meets from time to time. I was at one of those meetings once, but do you know how, you know, robust that communication is? And
well, I'm going to invite, there's a couple county agency folks on this call. I know that the Hudson Valley Regional Council hosts those meetings, but would Ermin or Carrie or anybody else who participates want to chime in?
Sure. I'm Carrie from Dutchess County. I think we all communicate frequently. We use each other as resources for information and ideas, and we do have our quarterly regional meetings. However, we're in contact on a more frequent basis for a variety of different issues that one county can help out another.
Great. And, you know, what do you think, just top of the head, in terms of multi-county collaboration really tackling one material at a time? I mean, I know I'm daring to be naive.
So I think, in my opinion, that yes, it's a good idea. However, we all manage our materials just slightly different. No two are exactly the same in how we were set up for material management. For instance, here in Dutchess County, we don't own or operate any transfer stations on a county level. There are local municipalities that do it, or private. We do have the burn plant. And I'll just briefly mention the 2030 40% reduction of greenhouse gas levels will be challenging and will require working with DEC, you know, in hopes in getting our next permit. So it is an uphill battle. That being said, with the incineration plant, you know, we have a great reduction already compared to other surrounding areas in dealing with the waste transport issue. So that's just my 2 cents.
Well, God bless everyone who is working in that industry, because it sure is not easy. But I'm hoping we can have some more discussions about where there might be leverage points and any way that, you know, non-governmental supporters might play a useful role. So I just, you know, sketched out, you know, suppose this year we get a handle on more of what the materials flows are and the infrastructure that we have. And suppose we start brainstorming, what are diversion opportunities? It's always tempting to say what are the limitations and the barriers, but at least what are the opportunities might be worthwhile. And I just this is just an imagination exercise. Suppose we played with one priority project in the next year and another one a couple years out. I don't know, got to do something.
It looks like John Rath has his hand up.
Okay, John.
Thank you. I work for New York Geothermal Energy Organization, but I live in Poughkeepsie and I try to get involved in other things. One of my interests has been composting in Poughkeepsie. And so I'm relatively new to the area, but my understanding is that county legislatures really kind of direct the recovery and recycling and waste management programs. So I'm wondering how important it would be to, one, get some kind of consensus from the different county legislators, as well as develop a strategic plan amongst and for all of the different counties. I respect your focus on action, but I don't think there can be any action until there's some kind of consensus and a plan.
Yes, we had a version of this where almost every to-do was develop a strategic plan. And something inside me just went, no, I can't publish that, because we'll all die if we're only planning. But you're absolutely right. What we've been able to do with this thing is kind of top line imagining. What do we need to get done? And if we can generate excitement around that and generate a sense that there may be more opportunities than we've realized, then I think we can pull together the levels of expertise that are really needed, and do that strategic planning.
I agree with you about the pain of strategic plans. I wish I had a better answer.
Yeah, no, I love them, but they're just, you have to have the juice first. Let me get through just the basic review a little more quickly, and then let's go back to a few concluding slides that are really, what could we do with this, okay? So I'm not going to belabor, but to Jeff's point about nature, we've got to max out nurturing nature. We've got to, and I think the climate law, although it hasn't been as much of a media focus, bioeconomy is a huge thrust. We looked at how important it is to prove regenerative practices, not just in general, but on the different conditions that apply around the valley so that farmers can see it works for them. And at land use, there's going to be substantially increased funding and probably policy direction for land conservation. How do we bring that home? Scenic Hudson is thinking hard about this. We had a call with them and the New York State Association of Conservation Councils. I'm not sure if Simon is on now, but we had a call yesterday about how do we scale up regenerative practices faster on protected lands, and then also how do we don't not roll over and allow sprawl to happen and make smart growth impossible to ignore. And I think Paul Byer from Department of State was going to try to be on this call, and that's a line I stole from him. But land use, agriculture, forestry, and then water. One of our participants was Peggy Kurtz from the Rockland Water Coalition, and they have done very sophisticated research on how do you create water conservation and efficiency systems, and how do you plan for water supply management. It's not unknown. The Hudson River Watershed Alliance has done amazing work with a strategic plan for what has to be done to protect our watersheds. And they need and deserve massively more funding to get that done. Right now, there's no particular provision. Somebody needs to mute. There's no particular provision to make it required that when a new development happens, we make sure there's really water supply, not just water infrastructure, but actual supply. So the last piece, we tried to look at capturing community benefits, and not just in saving ourselves from disaster, but in leveraging what we do so that it is intentional and has multiple uses. That's the big theme here. And I'll digress for half a second to say we had a conference last week, and we had some of our project interns speaking out from the perspective of youth. And, one of them, Brianna Black, who had worked on agrivoltaics for this project, said, we need to understand that every solution has to have multiple uses. We can't just do things that fix one problem. So, something like half the counties in the US have experienced climate disasters at this point. And climate resilience is something that, even if you're affluent and happy and go to the gym and shop at Whole Foods, you're at risk from storms and floods. And if you live in a so-called disadvantaged community that has poor housing stock and no tree cover and heat island effect, you're even more vulnerable. And so there is a tremendous amount of New York State investment in planning for, floodplains and sea level rise and waterfronts and shorelines. What we noticed is missing and needed is more neighborhood scale. And it's so vast. Think of every neighborhood you live in, and how do we make sure that people are safe in heat waves and in crazy weather? And so the notion of placemaking comes into the conversation. The idea that it's localized urban design. It's, the rain garden that happens, like Kingston Point Park has landscape, changes, redesign, so that it absorbs water in floods, and it's also a cool place the rest of the time. So this is something we hope to build support for and build funding for, and especially in areas like Newburgh and Poughkeepsie and Kingston, where there are communities that have been left behind. And, I don't know if Ed Lawson would be put on the spot if I mentioned his name and said that in Newburgh, there's just beginning to be a cluster of people who have a coffee shop and a farm and, are inhabiting some square blocks where there's beginning to be a resilience hub of sorts, of people just thinking about how their planning can interface. Ed, would you want to comment, or?
Well, I think whether you call it resilience hubs, whether you call it in community engagement or involvement, what we understand is that there should really be nothing about us without us, and we need to build this level of, or erase apathy and erase inequity, and allow people to be empowered to have a say in what goes on in their communities. And so from my vantage point, what we're seeing now is the groundswell of just getting people back out to engage in this conversation. We're not having this conversation in the hallways and in the churches and in the community centers like we're having it here. And as a result, I think it could create some challenges. So anything that we can do to begin to center the conversation around health and well-being in communities is where, and that's what we've done to try to get energy back. And we haven't talked about all of this really fancy stuff and really, really important stuff. What we really simply said, and when we've had these conversations, we've centered the Newburgh's community health and well-being. And what I would say, as it relates to resiliency hubs, if communities around the country, around the world, just started with that, just started with, hey, how do we increase our health and well-being? And how do we create a space where we're more health literate so that we can navigate and to have conversations that affect real change? I think that's what we're seeing. And we're excited because we get to partner better with folks like that are on this call, because oftentimes it can become very adversarial if we don't know parties' intent. But as everybody becomes more literate, I think that improves the conversation. So I'm all for resiliency hubs, but I think what I'm also for is being very common language oriented and being very literacy driven, so that everybody is clear about the end game and the finish line.
Great, thank you. And one of the other topics that has come up within the environmental justice conversation is, how can we not just have access to resources, but how can we own assets and look at all these jobs? And so part of what's going on in Newburgh with Ed's leadership and others is engaging young people in solar apprenticeship career pathways. One of the pieces in terms of economic development that we came up with is just really strengthening and connecting the entrepreneurs, the investors, the people who are not part of the workforce who could be, by building strong networks. And Ulster has started that approach, but that's the kind of thing we need to offer and do lots more. There is a question of how do we pay for it? There's a ton of money, and a number of us are trying to figure out how that money flows. But we did put in the toolkit a fair amount of links to funding resources, and there will be more. There's everything from energy lending bank programs that nobody knows about, to a group of finance folks trying to replicate what the Environmental Facilities Corporation is doing to allow municipalities to bond for building electrification. So hopefully bringing some explicit strategies forward will help bring people together to share all these siloed pieces of information. And, education wise, we had a lot of skilled classroom educators and retired school administrators and wonderful folks thinking about the education work. We need to mobilize at the local level and educate influencers and educate people who would otherwise be left behind to understand what's going on. And climate literacy and science, technology, resilience, renewal, energy, art, engineering, I guess, arts and math. It needs to be multidisciplinary, obviously. I'm going to just quickly identify a handful of projects and that have shaken out of this, and they're by no means all the projects, but just some buckets to be thinking about. Yes, in my backyard for climate tech, resilience hubs by whatever name, just neighborhood, helping the neighborhood to take charge of its future. Green economy networks. We could call this making clean transportation work. Regenerative land use, and then educate, train, and inspire. These are all unfunded mandates, and I'm going to be sitting here at my dining room table writing proposals for a long time, unless some other people want to do that with me. But these are kind of action categories that I have confidence in from the study, the dive that we did, that are big enough to matter and small enough to identify. So in a sense, we did what we set out to do. In terms of putting it all together, I am kind of excited about a vision. It's called an impact network, and it's, it's not a rigid coalition. It's a little more flexible, but it's organizations that commit to joint strategic planning around some goals. And they don't have to commit to aligning on anything else. But it's pretty well developed kind of field when you delve into it. One that I'm so excited about this. It's a network in the Midwest. It's mainly nonprofits and funders, 130 organizations, and they set goals and they work strategically together with their big goal is to retire fossil fuels from the Midwest. And they've gotten a bunch of coal plants closed. And we're about to get them on a webinar to talk about their model and how it might guide us. So quote from a book, oh boy. But there is, I'll do a book group if anybody wants to. The idea that there could be a network that's maybe a bit of a matured version of the Mid-Hudson Regional Sustainability Coalition, but that could organize around taking on these goals and supporting those who are responsible, who work in all the various agencies, creating the conditions for success. While we get there, ways to participate. You can and send roadmap@sustainhb.org. You can endorse the vision and commit to the timelines in your own work. You can commit to a project. You can join our learning network, and you can also bring a presentation, preferably with an interactive workshop to your community. We did one in January with the Rhinebeck Comprehensive Plan Group with about 60 people, and I had a blast. I think everybody had a blast. So that's what I've got, with huge thanks for your patience and interest. And I see life in the chat. Overall feedback. I mean, I haven't learned how to not make this a fire hose.
You did have a comment from Emily in the chat.
Can you capture it?
Sure. So I just read an interesting article about transitioning to different jobs. This is an historic example. In 1972, Schaefer Brewery in Albany was closed. At the same time, Albany was building wastewater plant and hired 40 laid-off brewery employees. They had experience in operating pumping, conveyance, and other equipment that was applicable to the wastewater plant.
Yes, economic conversion. I mean, that's done all the time, and but it's not recognized, and it's really important, and it can be done, and we can organize it more at the local level.
Well, some of the fear mongering that I've heard about is about people losing jobs, in fossil fuel industry. And I think if there was more overt attempts to lay out some of the things they could transition to in a more concrete way, rather than just, too vague promises of jobs, then I think that would be helpful.
Yes, and our offices of employment and training are working on this, but there's always a disconnect. So I think some of the partnerships, community organizations like libraries, are places where we really need to bring this out. I'd love to hear from people that I don't know. Just, what sticks with you as potentially useful? What would you like us to do differently?
Well, you know me, but I'm going to speak, and it's not about doing anything differently. I want to congratulate you and the team because I think there's an amazing amount of resources here. And you've brought a lot of potential to keep inspiring people and making those connections. I at the conference, there were people talking about pilot projects and innovation. And I think that it would be really useful to have the website, have a place to share that kind of information because I think pilot projects are just really important. And so, if there's a network of people who, can have these projects going and case studies and learn from each other about that kind of thing, it would be really cool.
We could do that. I'm going to offer another one of these next week, the 19th at noon, and can offer them for specific teams at specific times. The weather is getting nice. I would love to get out and do them not at my dining room table.
So Gail is suggesting a video to share of positive initiatives that people could take to local meetings and show at open discussions in QA.
We could do that. A short video has been suggested, but maybe, yeah, I can see how it could summarize this and then take some highlights because there's a ton. Good. Okay, well, I'm just delighted to see everybody. I really appreciate your feedback. I know it's a lot to digest. Jeffrey Scales just, when I said I made the fire hose comment, he just said, I'm going to go dry off now. Two new messages. Emily, keep pushing the envelope. Yes, thank you. Follow-ups, follow-ups, follow-ups. Yes. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
I set you free. Roadmap at sustainhb.org. Love to hear from you.